VRFish has invited me back to my old stomping ground, Port Phillip Bay, to help highlight some of the good catch and release measures for snapper, as well as the problems of barotrauma. So it's snapper fishing time. Now, while we're waiting for a bite, we should probably just flick over to Paul Hardy-Smith, who I interviewed on an earlier trip. Now, fishing has been my life, and it started here in Port Phillip Bay, and the whole thing was about catching snapper. It was the dream, and in those early days, that's, well, we should say 40 odd years ago now, it was a tough gig. Catching a snapper was a week-long exercise, but now, the snapper everywhere, the fishing's really good, and you can go out and catch 20 or 30 fish in a morning. But as anglers, I'd like to say we're at the forefront of conservation, that we want to do something, we want to be a part of it, a part of looking after those fish, and releasing snapper is becoming a big thing, isn't it? It's changing. But what I've found, and from you guys, from what your research is, Paul, that because I let a snapper go and it swims off, in those early days when I wrote for Modern Fishing and all that, letting them go on camera or on film and stuff, and they'd swim off, it's all been great. But we're finding a few things that it's not quite up to scratch, that there's more to the story, isn't there?
Yeah, and look, when you let a fish go, it'll race off. Of course it will, it's a survival thing, but what most fishermen don't see is what happens an hour, 2 hours, 2 days later after that. And fishermen see that fish swim off really quickly, and they say, oh, absolutely fine, I'll just keep fishing, but it's not always the case, particularly with snapper. And it's good now because we've got a lot of research that just shows some of the impacts that the fishermen can have on bringing in that fish. For example, how long you fight the fish. I mean, the longer that fish fights, the more you have changes inside its body, metabolic changes that will, for example, drop its pH, increase its lactic level. These are things it's got to cope with if you then suddenly have to release them. The other big thing is the depth from which you catch fish. It's actually been found with snapper that anything greater than 11 metres, you've got to be aware that the fish you bring in might suffer from barotrauma. And barotrauma is really about expanding of gases, if you like. Snapper have got a swim bladder, and it's a closed swim bladder. Some fish don't. Some fish can actually have an open swim bladder. With snapper, it's a closed swim. The swim bladder is a gas sort of bladder inside them, and what it means is that when they go down to depth, they can sit down a reef at 20 metres, and just like the diver who puts gas into his buoyancy compensation device, or a BC as we call it, they can go down there, put some gas into that swim bladder, and it means that they're what they call neutrally buoyant. They can just roam around that reef without expending any energy to come up or down. But that bit of gas at sort of 20 metres, when you pull that fish up, if it catches, it takes your bait, comes up, it's going to expand quite markedly. And you can imagine in a closed container, for example, if you even pull it up from 10 metres, if you pull up, the amount of gas at 10 metres will double once it hits the surface. So what happens there is suddenly, a lot of fishermen have seen this, they'll see come up with a fish with its stomach outside its mouth, because what's going to happen in there with that gas bladder opening up, it's going to displace things like the stomach, it's going to put damage on other organs like the liver, and you'll even get some bleeding and stuff. And also what we really... It's pressure. It's all about pressure, expanding pressure, expanding bubble, and if it can get as bad as actually causing bubbles in the blood. So it's all about pressure, and pressure changes, and the trouble is though, that change has happened once they hit the surface. And so people who think that then they can just throw the fish back in, the damage has been done once it's hit the surface. It won't happen to all of them, but as fishermen we need to know anything after 11 metres, remember there's a percentage that could be damaged by the barotrauma.
Can I ask, why is it 11 metres? Is it because what happened? How did you guys research them? Obviously, right out into the centre of the bay there to see what. And
I'd love to say I did the personal research. I can't. A lot of the research we did was fortunately done off New South Wales, where they basically followed hundreds of fish that were being brought in by fishermen and opening up these fish and looking for changes in these fish, and they were recording where they actually caught the fish from. Yeah. And they basically, that's where they identified the 11 metre mark. They said that after 11 metres, that's when they started to see the signs of barotrauma, the bleeding, the hemorrhage, the expansion changes in the fish that were being released. After 20 metres, interestingly, they also found quite a high percentage, a huge percentage of them actually were starting to even see tears, for example, in the swim bladder. The swim bladder had expanded so much, it just popped.
Yeah, it's giving more stress. And that's the beauty, I suppose, of Port Phillip Bay, is that I think half of it's under 10 metres or under 15 metres, so it's actually quite shallow. In New South Wales, we're fishing into 30, 40 metres.
That's right.
So here, it's one of those perfect scenarios that you can fish shallow, and like exactly here, we've moved right into, I think, into 8 metres of water coming to the shallows. On that same note, I suppose it's really important to consider that the barotrauma is something we can't work for or against, you know, do we bring them up slower? It doesn't really make any difference?
No, it's interesting because a lot of people come to me, I'm talking to people, they say, oh, perhaps if we just bring them in slowly. You're going to be talking about maybe some scientists have made an estimation of sort of 2.5 metres per hour to bring them in. No one's going to do that.
That's just not going to happen.
Because it's interesting, because they're actually getting that gas out of their bloodstream and putting it in that way. That's how they get the gas in, that's how they get it out. So it's got to go in and out through the blood. It takes a long time. You can't get them in slow enough to minimise the effect.
And it's not like when they come up and they just blow bubbles and it's done.
No.
You know how you see the snapper come up and it blows a few bubbles. Oh, yeah, he's just exhaling, that'll be right. It's not. And these are all these common misconceptions, aren't they, that people go, oh no, that'll be fine. And it's not.
And the fish generally, they'll try and get away. Of course they will. That's their natural thing. But what you won't see as an angler is what's happened inside and the damage done, unless it's a really obvious one where it's got the stomach out the mouth. But a lot of them are not that obvious.
And I suppose the important part there, or I think the critical thing is that what we've got to remember is these fish are coming in to spawn in Port Phillip Bay. So even if he does survive through that trauma, I suppose, you know, he's got minor rips or something, that may still affect the spawning.
Yeah.
So you're in effect, you're not really helping the system. And as fishermen, we don't want to just a sustainable fishery. We want to enhance it. We want to make it better. Now, if we fish inside, so say we've caught some fish out in 15, 16 metres, caught a couple to eat.
Yep.
If we come back and fish inside 11 metres, is that okay for the barotrauma? Or is it still
certainly,
an issue?
if you go back in, certainly, if it's less than 11 metres, the chances of barotrauma occurring in that fish are markedly reduced, for sure. But of course, barotrauma is only one of the things that can impact on the health of a fish. So other big things, as I said before about the fight, they're on a line, as they're fighting, they're like us doing a running race. They're building up metabolites in the system from that. Real big one, of course, which is a huge one, which I see a lot of anglers not understanding, is air exposure. So you bring a fish out. The minute you bring a fish out, particularly one that's just had a hard run, it's like you going for a run and suddenly holding your breath. You know, what you're suddenly doing, this fish is really needing oxygen.
That's a really good call.
Unfortunately.
You're right. I hadn't even thought of it like that. As soon as you said it, it dawned on me.
Absolutely.
You go for a flat stick for a run and go, now, hold your breath.
Hold your breath. So that's what I try to say to people, because the minute you come out, even though we can take oxygen out of this air, the fish can't, because all its gill structure just collapses. Other big thing, of course, is you all know the build up inside you of carbon dioxide. You're trying to get that off when you go for a run. That's why you pump. Fish are doing the same thing. So you pull them out, you suddenly stop that being able to get out of the fish. So really critical, guys, if you are catching fish, even in shallow water, one, get them in quickly, and if you're going to release them, straight back in the water, try and minimise any time out of the water, because actually real seconds count on that. The fish, I can just say, just start holding your breath when you're holding them out of the water, and don't start taking a breath.
See how long you can hold them as well.
Yeah.
So in closing, use circle hooks, use J hooks with drag on. When you get the fish up, let's get up fast, support it. If we can let it go in the water, do so. If you get it in, have everything prepared. They're holding their breath, so you don't want them out of the water too long. Get it done fast, have everything ready to go. Use the net if you can to support it. If not, use your hand, support it. Obviously no hot decks or anything like that. And when you're letting it go, just put it in gently as quick as you can and get him back in that water. And if you've caught your limit or you've caught enough to eat,
stop fishing. Just remember, if you're fishing at depth, definitely just stop fishing, because you won't be able to minimise that damage of the barotrauma if it's a fish that suffers from that.
Otherwise, go and stay inside 11 metres and catch more snapper. While we're sitting here waiting for a bite, it's probably worth looking through the history of Port Phillip Bay. Now, I fished it since a kid, and in those old days, it was near impossible to get a snapper. You know, in the old days, I was scallop dredging. It was a really, really hard fishery to actually end up with a snapper. Yet now, it's got so good that people catch snapper every day. Even today, we've only, caught a few fish. We're complaining about it. And I think this is the important thing, and this is why it's so important that we learn to look after these fish. We learn how to release them properly. If you get to your bag limit, just stop fishing. Go and fish for something else. Go and chase whiting, go and catch squid, or go home. And even on that same note, just as a personal point, you don't have to take your bag limit. Just take what you need at that time, because the fishery here is now world class. You think of it, there are hundreds and hundreds of boats out here today on a weekday. Where else in the world would you do that? And we're all catching fish. That's the beauty of Port Phillip Bay. But instead of making it sustainable, we have to enhance it. And by doing that, only take what you need, always stay well under the bag limit, and of course, let those fish go. And that way, this fishery will just get better and better. Now, it's probably even worth mentioning that the bag limit here in Victoria is 3 fish over 40 centimetres. And you think of it, the average fish is, say, 3 kilos. So that's 9 kilos of fish you can take home every day. So what's really important is we need to think about not just keeping the fish, but what you're doing with it, because you don't want to leave it so that it ends up at the bottom of the freezer. So eat it fresh, utilise it, otherwise let them go. Whoop, there's a bite. Here we go. Ooh, that's a better fish. All right, now one thing that's really important is to use circle hooks. With the circle hook's designed to hook the fish in the mouth, and even though it looks silly with it bent over like that, it'll bounce up through the gullet and catch on the corner. Look at that, perfectly in the corner of the mouth. That's the priority, that's what we really need to do. If you hook them in the mouth, there's minimal damage, and the chance of survival from all the research is dramatically higher than obviously gut hooking or hooking in the vitals around the gills or anything like that. You can still use J hooks. The key is though that you must do it quickly, that you hook up, don't let the fish run. So fish your reels and drag, as soon as you're on, hook up and you'll hook him in the mouth. That's the key, get them in the mouth and the chances of survival are a lot higher. There's a couple of ways you can let these fish go. First and foremost, it's about minimal pressure on it. So you don't want to bring it on board, drag it across the deck and let it bang around. You want to get them up, you want to do it all quickly of course. You want to unhook him and then get him back straight away. If you can unhook them in the water, do so. It can be a bit hard. You get a pair of pliers and you literally lift them over like that, shake it and drop them off. In the case of this fish here, he's actually, as you can see, he's only just hooked right in the mouth. Just in there. So what we can probably do with this one is you can actually do it here in the water. You just roll it over, just gently. Okay, so you minimise your handling on them. Get that line out of the way. And then just let him go like that. And you can see there what I've done is I've kept him in the water. He's only mouth hooked. Don't turf them back in if you can. Just let him do it nice and gently like that. And then he'll want to kick. Look at that, just powering straight down, going back where he's meant to be. If you do have to use a net and bring it on board, use one of those Enviro nets that have got the rubber as opposed to the netting, because you want to minimise or scratches or anything to the skin. And with the old sort of the coarser nets that we used to have, what it would do is actually rub the skin and damage them. So to minimise the impact. Of course, if you do lift them up at all, support the fish. It's an easy process. We've got to look after these fish. If you do catch a heap of them, you know, they go mad. You sit there and suddenly all the rods are going off. You can keep a few, there's obviously nothing wrong with that, but if you're letting them go, you've got to do it right. And if you do get your bag limit, probably the best thing to do is either go inside 11 metres where we know it's not affecting them, or stop fishing. Either way, one snapper down.